Which players will be part of the Mets core in 2025 and beyond? We're going to talk about that on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Today's episode of Locked On Mets is brought to you by Tax Network USA. Did you know that it's never too late to resolve your tax issues with the IRS? Don't wait. Reduce your tax debt and get help from a team of licensed tax professionals by calling 1-800-549-1000 or visit tnusa.com/lockedon. The Mets played a great game on Wednesday night, blowing at the Miami Marlins by a score of 10-4. I will give you your full game recap and takeaways in the final segment today. But first, I want to open the show on an article I wrote for justbaseball.com. This is something that I pretty much was up all night writing. After I finished yesterday's show and did some of my other stuff for Just Baseball, I just had this thought in my head. All right, what's the core of the New York Mets? Who are the players that they're building around? Where is the core of the next World Series team? And I ended up just like I have always loved to do. Writing is always my first passion when it comes to my career, the thing that brought me into this landscape when I was 19 years old. And I had that moment that I used to get a little more often. It's now a little more rare with how much. No, I like where I'm going with this. TN.com USA /locked on. Now, the New York Mets had a great victory over the Marlins on Wednesday night. They did what they're supposed to against a bad team, blew them out 10-4. I'm going to give you a full game recap and takeaways in the final segment today. But I really wanted to open the show on an article that I wrote for justbaseball.com. Last night, after I finished up the show and I did some of my editing work for Just Baseball, I just had this thought. Who are the players that are in the Mets core? What is the core identity of this team? And what will it be whenever, if ever, they reach the mountaintop again? So I so rarely get it nowadays because a lot of my job at Just Baseball is editing other people's writings. But every once in a while, I get an opportunity to write something for me. And this was that, where I got to just sort of pour my thoughts and feelings into a keyboard about the New York Mets and see what I came out of it. And you can read the full article. I'll put it in the episode description today. But to surmise what I was going through, it was about finding out what a core is, right? And it's simple, okay? Every team has a core. Even the bad teams have a core. If you look at Washington right now, they have a core of, C.J. Abrams, Mackenzie Gore is a core piece. James Wood, top prospect in baseball, coming up. He's going to be a core piece. There's pieces that they have in mind to build around for the better part of the next 5 years to a decade, right? That's the identity of that team. So every team has a core, but the cores that are great are the ones that win and win on a consistent basis. And if you want to look at an example of that, look no further than Houston over the last decade. You can talk about the sign stealing scandal and everything else, but between Jose Altuve, Alex Bregman, at one point Carlos Correa, he's moved on, Yordan Alvarez, now Kyle Tucker. They have had an evolving core, and it really starts and ends with Jose Altuve, and Bregman might leave now too. So Altuve's been the guy. It's about finding those core players, building around them, and being able to hopefully put up banners. And the Astros have done that. Of course, you go back to the Yankees teams with the core four. There's always that inner circle of players that you are building around. And in Mets history, of course, the last time this franchise won a championship is 1986. And you think about the makeup of that team, Darryl Strawberry debuts and becomes Rookie of the Year in 1983. Doc Gooden in 1984 becomes the Rookie of the Year. So consecutive Rookies of the Year. Keith Hernandez traded there, 84. Gary Carter comes into the mix. And that was the core. If you look like the four best players on that team, that's probably the group that you would have, which, of course, Doc, Darryl, Keith, Gary. And then they had other pieces, right? There's Ron Darling and, Lenny Dykstra comes up, Kevin Mitchell and Sid Fernandez. And you add pieces from free agency, you develop pieces. It's always going to be a ton of different series of moves that get you to that promised land. But it has to start with a core. And since 1986, And the years that have followed since, the Mets have struggled to put together a championship-worthy core. You could say they had it for a fleeting moment with Mike Piazza, Edgardo Alfonso, Robin Ventura, that whole team of the late 90s, early 2000s. They were good, but they weren't good enough. 2006, right, to get to what was a really good Mets team that really underperformed and failed to meet expectations. It was David Wright and Jose Reyes coming up and being foundational pieces. And then signing Carlos Beltran. And for a moment, it was Pedro Martinez. And Carlos Delgado was a huge trade. And then eventually try to make Johan Santana a core player. And then that team doesn't work. And then you go to a rebuild. And all of a sudden, it's Matt Harvey who comes up. And he's a core player. And then it's Zach Wheeler. And, Jacob deGrom's a rookie of the year. And you have Noah Syndergaard and Steven Matz. You have this core of pitchers while still having guys that have been around for a long time in the Lucas Dudas and Daniel Murphys of the world. You sign Curtis Granderson to a 4-year deal. He becomes a core player for a period of time. There's different layers to the core. Granderson's not in the inner core, but he's still part of it. So you look at this current Mets team. What has been the core? What has been the core of the Steve Cohen era? There's 3 names that top the list. It's Pete Alonso, Francisco Lindor, Brennan Nimmo. And then there's other guys that have also been there the whole time. Edwin Diaz and Jeff McNeil. Then you have someone like Starling Marte signed to a 4-year deal in 2022. The Mets won 101 games. That year, it looked like the Mets had a good core. They had a window. Well, that window seems to be closing. And you look at that core, right? The inner core ultimately has performed pretty well. But some of those guys around the edges, McNeil falling off, Starling Marte looked great tonight and maybe is showing some signs of life. But you look at the defensive metrics, he's not the same type of impact player that the Mets signed a couple of years ago. It's just not. Edwin Diaz, is he going to get back to that top level form? We believe so, but still, there's questions. And so with all these questions with the core, you have to wonder what the next version of the Mets look like. Who can end up, barging the way in and being a next member of that inner core? So you think about this current team, and Francisco Alvarez jumps to mind. A guy that you hope is your catcher for a decade, who could be an impact guy on both sides, defensively and with his bat. You currently are watching Mark Vientos smash his way into the conversation with his bat. He's been unbelievable. He's looking like a guy that you can potentially build around a little bit. Is he going to be Pete Alonso 2.0? Long way away from figuring that one out. But can he be a really nice player for you? Has he looked a lot better at third base defensively than any of us expected? He could be the third baseman of the future. And when you make these decisions about your core, you really have to think short-term and long-term. And the Mets are staring down the barrel of a very tough decision. Because, as I talk about a lot in the article, Pete Alonso has been every bit a core player of the New York Mets since 2019. He comes up, he wins the rookie home run record, he leads the Mets in the second half to what was a really good finish. 2020, disappointment. 2021, disappointment. But Alonso producing the whole time. 2022, the height of his career as a Met up to this point, winning 101 games, making it to the playoffs for the first and potentially only time. And then the last couple of years have been a struggle. But you look up at Pete Alonso and the production is always there. Even this year where he hasn't been his best, or last year hits 46 home runs in a down year. This year, you look at some of the numbers. I know he didn't have the best game today, but overall, I was looking at his WRC plus before the game, measuring hitters on a league average of 100, and it was 129, almost 30% better than league average, which is right around his career mark, if I'm not mistaken. So as bad as it's looked at times, he has still produced. And when it comes to what it means to be a Met on the field, off the field, he has exceeded expectations. He has done everything right when it comes to being the face of your franchise. He might throw an F word in the LGM and make it LFGM. And that's a little bit funny and quirky. And maybe some parents didn't like it in the beginning, right? But this guy hasn't had very many missteps. He's great in the community. He does charity work. He says the right things when cameras are on him. And he produces and he plays. There's a reason why he leads Major League Baseball in home runs and RBI since his debut. It's because he's durable and he's productive. Aaron Judge, when it comes to home run rate, would be the best, but he's missed 140 some odd games since Alonso has come into the picture in 2019. I say all of that because Alonso could go from face of the franchise to fall guy because he's the one piece from this core that can be removed easily. Brandon Nimmo, Lindor, under long-term contracts. Edwin Diaz getting 9 figures on his deal altogether as a closer. Not many teams are going to want to take that, and I don't think the Mets want to send him anywhere either. Jeff McNeil, no one's touching that contract. Starling Marte, probably the same thing unless you eat it down. There's only so much you can talk about when it comes to those guys. Yeah, we can have a conversation about Marte and McNeil being dealt. Might happen. But that's not going to drastically change the course of this franchise. Pete Alonso will. That's what I want to talk about in the next segment. Is Pete Alonso a core member of this team? Do they view him in that light? Or with the emergence of Mark Vientos, has he become expendable to the point that he will no longer be part of the Mets core moving forward? So I want to go through all of that in the next segment. First, though, a word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million members. It is the easiest and most exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less than 2 or more player stats, and you watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks has something for every sports fan, from baseball to basketball to even League of Legends. There's WNBA, and you can combine all of them in the same entry. So if you look at Pete Alonso's fantasy score at 7 today, you could take more on that while also looking at a WNBA game or Stanley Cup Finals. And you can combine all that in the same entry. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types to choose from. Prize Picks is the #1 fantasy sports app. Download the Prize Picks app today. Use the code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the Prize Picks app today. Use the code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy with Prize Picks. Today's episode is brought to you by Policygenius. You never know what can happen in life. That is why it's always best to be prepared. Make sure your family is taken care of. This is why everyone should have life insurance, but sometimes finding the right policy is not easy. It can be really time consuming, even overwhelming. This is where Policygenius comes in. Policygenius is the country's leading online insurance marketplace that will save you time and money so you can provide your family with a financial safety net. With Policygenius, you can find new policies that start at $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer same-day approval and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Policygenius helps you compare quotes from America's top insurers in just a few clicks and find your lowest price, and their team of licensed experts is on hand to help talk you through the whole thing. Policygenius will give you unbiased advice from their licensed expert team, so they have no incentive to recommend one insurer over another. So check life insurance off your to-do list in no time with Policygenius at policygenius.com/LockedOnMLB, or click the link in the episode description to get your free life insurance quotes. See how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/LockedOnMLB. If you're an everyday listener of the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service where you get updates anytime something breaks in the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime. You also will take part in our Locked On Mets signed photo giveaways, and you get the lineup graphics sent to your phone each day. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Now, is Pete Alonso a core member of the New York Mets moving forward? This is a really tough question to answer, and ultimately the Mets will tell us in short order here. What will they do? Here's what I'd say. You have to look towards the next core and figure out what you're going to need. And what will make up that next core for the New York Mets? Well, you know it's going to have Nimmo and Lindor. And it's going to have Diaz for a couple more years as well. Those things are pretty set. Jeff McNeil, probably there as well. Is he a starter anymore? At this point, maybe not. But those are the pieces you know, right? And then you have the prospects that are going to come up. So the Mets have a very pitching-rich system right now. Offensively, though, the prospects are a little bit fewer and further between. You do have Jet Williams and Drew Gilbert, but neither of them have really played this year due to injuries, and Williams pretty much won't play until maybe the end of August. You have Luis Angel Acuna in AAA, not having the best season. You have further down the line, Kevin Parada, Alex Ramirez, Ryan Clifford, very excited about him. And then, of course, there's many others, Nick Morabito, and we go on and on down the line when it comes to position players. But Who's the guy that can slug like Pete Alonso that's coming up the pipeline? There's two names that maybe jump out from the prospects. That's Ronnie Mauricio, who's hurt obviously this year, and there's Ryan Clifford. And then if you look at the MLB roster, you have a young guy, Mark Vientos, that I was writing articles and doing podcasts about in 2021, comparing him to Pete Alonso. Banging my hand on the table back then and in 2022 about why JD Davis was taking time away from Mark Vientos where they could have been getting him seasoning. Now, here we are years later, and Vientos finally getting an opportunity, and he's delivering, and he's actually looking good at third base. He is graded out as a positive defender at third. I actually have to check that because he made an error, on Tuesday night. So that might have adjusted that a little bit. But before that game, he was a net positive defensively, which I never could have seen that coming. So is he the third baseman of the future moving forward? Or is Mark Vientos going to go to what would probably be a more natural fit positionally with his skill set at first, where he wouldn't be as tested as he's going to be in the hot corner? And Brett Beatty has shown a lot defensively this year. So if you're going to decide if Alonso is going to be part of the core moving forward, you got to figure out who's next. So if you're going to figure out if Pete Alonso is part of the core moving forward, you have to understand what you have coming to be part of it. So if Pete Alonso is going to be part of your core moving forward, you have to figure out who else will be. And how does Alonso fit with those pieces? And you can make an argument that the Mets should stick youth, trade Pete Alonso at the deadline to add some prospects to their system, and let Vientos be the starting first baseman because he's going to be way cheaper and he's under team control. So you could do that. But what if Brett Beatty doesn't hit? Never. He never hits. But wouldn't you like to have Vientos at third base still? That's the decision that has to be made here is, who do you want to build around? Do you want to continue building around Pete Alonso? Because Pete Alonso on a long-term deal could be an amazing DH for the Mets for years to come. Don't even worry about the glove anymore. Vientos can handle that. He's younger. Let him eat up those innings. You just focus on DH and crushing baseballs well into your 30s. And Pete Alonso is 47 home runs away from Darryl Strawberry for the top mark in Mets franchise history. Funny enough, I wrote in the article, had the Mets manipulated Pete Alonso's service time, he probably breaks that record. He'd have one more year of control. Or if COVID didn't happen, he probably breaks that record. If Alonso had just gotten 6 full years or 6 to 7 years with the Mets, that's how quickly he could have done it. But now we don't know what they're going to do. I think there is a world where you pick every part of the Mets core when you're trying to decide what you believe in. So yeah, you believe down the line you're going to develop some great pitching. You believe right now that Alvarez, Beatty, and Vientos can be part of your future. You still believe what you have for the past 4 years, that Nimmo, Lindor, and Alonso are pieces to keep who can help get you there. Now, how does that all come together? It would require Pete Alonso to hit the market after playing out this whole season. And if you trade JD Martinez at the deadline, for example, you could all of a sudden have all 3 of these guys in the lineup every day. If you get Brett Beatty enough time in AAA at second base, he can be your starting second baseman if you really wanted to in the final 2 months. You can get these guys all in the lineup, or he can play left field, whatever it is. The Mets have to figure out who their core members are. And so that next core 4, whether that's Beatty, Alvarez, Vientos, and Christian Scott, or Ronnie Mauricio, whoever the next guys coming are, you have to figure out how they fit with your veterans. That is part of why you see Nimmo in left field right now, because long term, I think the Mets expected Drew Gilbert or a Jet Williams to be the starting center fielder. Lindor's not going anywhere off shortstop, but you always know you have that foundational piece. First base, Pete Alonso, Mark Vientos. It's fascinating to see what they do, because this guy in Vientos has proven that he might have some real staying power with the bat. But with Brett Beatty's inconsistencies, you're almost better to have him as your third baseman. And you wonder, is there a world where Mark Vientos and Pete Alonso can thrive on the team together at the same time? We are living in that world. That's happening right now. I'd love to see this Mets team make a run to take the decision off of their hands, where Pete Alonso is a Met for the rest of this season. They let him go on the market, and he might just come on back at a reasonable price. Because I look at the free agent class that includes Juan Soto, which would be the one upgrade, and then it's Alex Bregman and guys like Paul Goldschmidt who are far into their careers. I look at Alonso and I say, who would you rather have, Alonso or Alex Bregman? I don't know if Bregman's going to produce as well as he has in Houston when he doesn't have those Crawford boxes to hit into. I just don't know. I don't know how he'd handle going to New York. I do know that at third base right now, the Mets have Brett Beatty, Mark Vientos, Ronnie Mauricio, all as potential guys that could start at that position long term. They don't really need to address that. And you look at the rest of the free agent class, there's not another impact bat in sight. So bringing Alonso back makes a lot of sense. Having him part of the core long term, because he has done everything you could have asked from him up to this point. But if the Mets want to make a change, if the Mets want to try to flip up the just aura around this team and do something significant to address a roster that's underperformed for the last year and a half, Alonso will be the fall guy for the Mets. And it's just a fascinating thing to follow over the next 7 weeks. We'll see what happens. I'm going to give you a game recap. Mets blow out the Marlins. We'll talk about that in just a minute. First, though, a word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Tax Network USA. Here on Locked On Mets, we pride ourselves on getting you the latest news for your team, whether it's the offseason, the draft, spring training, or the playoffs. It's year-round. You know what else is year-round? Collection season. Just because tax season is over doesn't mean the IRS will stop coming after you for unfiled taxes. The IRS can garnish your wages, levy your bank accounts, and even seize your property. Don't let the IRS target you. Let the licensed professionals and tax experts at Tax Network USA go to bat for you. With over 14 years of experience and an A-plus rating by the Better Business Bureau, Tax Network USA has saved their clients over $1 billion in tax debt. Whether you owe taxes, have complicated matters that require tax planning, or finally hit that parlay this season and need help correctly filing, call 1-800-549-1000 or visit tnusa.com/lockedon. See the link in this episode's description below. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest for the NBA Finals and Stanley Cup Finals, make sure you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. That was a great game by the Mets on Wednesday night. They did what they're supposed to. They beat up on the Miami Marlins, and I want to give them a little bit of slack for how hard I came down on them on Tuesday, because I didn't forget, but I didn't really factor in enough how jet lagged and messed up the Mets probably were after that London series. They came out flat. It showed. This was a much better performance, and hopefully it snaps them back into regular season baseball mode, and they can go ahead and they can win this series on Thursday. But you look at the big change before the game even started. The lineup, a lot different, which is funny because if you listen to yesterday's show, all we talked about was the lineup. And what were the two main things I talked about? One, getting Nimmo out of the 3-hole. Two, putting Pete Alonso in the 4-hole. And I guess the third thing that we discussed was JD Martinez in the 3-hole. Sure enough, you had Martinez batting third, Alonso batting fourth. I also said on the show that the Mets might just give Nimmo a day off to clear his head. Well, we saw that as well. And Harrison Bader was batting second, and he took full advantage of that, hitting a 2-run homer to put the Mets on the board with an early lead. Now, David Peterson gave those 2 runs back in the second inning. Early in the game, I felt like both of these teams were lucky with the offense that they got, because the Mets had a rally after the Marlins won in the bottom of the second, where they scored 3 runs on just horrible defense. I mean, it was just brutal by the Marlins, and allowed the Mets to score a lot of runs. Meanwhile, the reason why I say both teams were lucky offensively, David Peterson was not hit very hard, particularly in that second inning. You look at the rally in the 5th, he earned the runs there a little bit more as he gave up some hard hit doubles. But early on in this game, I mean, they really weren't hitting them hard, and the hits that they had in the second that put runs on the board, I mean, it was cue shots. It was finding the hole on some ground balls. It just wasn't, a team on the other side that was comfortable and driving the baseball against David Peterson. Again, more of that came in the fifth, but I thought he threw the ball pretty well overall. He goes 5 innings. He gives up 8 hits, which is a lot, but again, some of them were some soft contact there. 4 earned runs, 2 walks, only 1 strikeout. He was sitting at 54 pitches going into that 5th inning, and then needed 30 pitches to get all the way out of it. I think had that been a shorter inning, if maybe the 30 pitch inning came earlier in the game, you might have seen David Peterson go out for another one. But considering how taxing that inning was on him, and the bullpen is still pretty rested after the London trip, it made sense to go to them. And they delivered absolutely in this game. Daniel Nunez, I think, kept himself on the roster with this performance. 7 outs, 7 batters he faced. He struck out 5. He has been the best pitcher in this pen, and I'm thrilled he was not optioned for Edwin Diaz, but Danny Young was, and I don't feel great about that one. We'll talk about that in a minute here. After Nunez, it was Jake Diekman, who did, get a couple outs with still allowing a hit. And then you had Reed Garrett, who pitched a scoreless 9th with 2 strikeouts. So the Mets really able to pitch well after Peterson, hold on to their lead. And offensively, they had 14 hits. They were 6 for 13 with runners in scoring position. Starling Marte homered, Francisco Lindor homered, Mark Vientos got an RBI hit. They just collectively all came together and put together a fantastic game. Now, Edwin Diaz is coming back. Danny Young was optioned, and I do not like this move. Since coming back to the Mets on May 30th, Danny Young has pitched in 7 of the Mets' 11 games. He's allowed just 1 earned run. He's recorded a strikeout in every appearance. He has 12 strikeouts out of the 18 outs that he's recorded. Only walked 1, has allowed just 3 hits. So he has struck out over half the batters he has faced since May 30th. And now you option him. You can't see him for 15 days unless somebody gets hurt and he fills in there. I don't love this move because I felt like Danny Young and Daniel Nunez have been pitching like the best 2 arms in this bullpen lately. Now, do I believe they should be the high leverage guys pitching the 9th and the 8th inning? Not necessarily, but they, to me, are not the problem. They've been a big part of the solution. So who has been a part of the problem that could be DFA'd? If this was a straight meritocracy, Adam Ottavino would have been DFA'd. Now, I get the track record that he brings, a very established veteran who I'm sure has some leadership qualities in that clubhouse. I get not pulling the ripcord there. And you look at Sean Reed, Foley, and Drew Smith, their numbers have been good this year. But I think Nunez has better stuff, so I'm glad he's still with the Mets. And I feel like Danny Young was such a valuable piece of this bullpen as a lefty that has a weird arm angle. He sort of comes to first base a little bit. So it's just tough for batters to pick up. And again, 12 strikeouts. That's really impressive with only 6 innings pitched across that span. The Mets were pretty much damned if you do, damned if you don't with all of these guys when it came to making a decision for bringing Edwin Diaz back. And Danny Young has the optionality. So he was the one guy, along with Nunez and even Garrett, that you could retain while optioning down. It makes sense on that front, but I still think that this bullpen just got worse, and they're getting Edwin Diaz back. But not having Danny Young as part of it, I think that is something that will hurt them in the next couple of weeks. Christian Scott is our last news item for the day. He did make a start for Syracuse today, 3 2/3, allowed 1 run on a homer. That's familiar, isn't it? 5 hits, 1 walk. Struck out 6 batters, got 11 outs in the game, threw 60 pitches, 46 of them were strikes. It's clear the Mets have him on a 60-pitch limit, and that's how they've decided to curtail his innings and slow down his workload throughout June. And they do have the off days in the 5-man rotation currently to follow through with that plan. But they also could, if they want to, make a bolder move. And Christian Scott, maybe he's not in the minor leagues until that 17-game, 17-day stretch that the Mets have to close out the first half before the All-Star break. That's when they're going to need a 6-man rotation, I believe, and we'll see Scott again. But there's a chance that he could come back sooner. If Jose Quintana starts and gets blown up or something else happens, it could be Scott here. I personally think they're wasting him in AAA, but clearly not my decision to make. So hopefully this all works out. You get Scott a little bit more later this season because he's conserving himself now. And maybe the Mets build him up to more than 120 130 innings. Maybe it's actually 150, which would be an incredible jump from 87 last year. But the point is, he's already thrown a lot of innings, and it's just going to continue. Maybe the Mets aren't really worried about the innings. It's more about the pitch count, the strain on his body. And if he says he's good and all the different data tells us he's good, well, maybe he's a guy that you push a little bit further and allow yourself to have a pitcher that actually can take that mantle next year and be a frontline guy potentially and take the ball every fifth day. So we'll see how the Mets ultimately decide to handle Christian Scott, something we'll be talking about more throughout the rest of this month. Anyway, that's all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. I hope you all enjoyed the show. If you're listening on the audio side, follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Trying to make a push to 9,000 subs. I appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. You can follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets.